Hey guys, tonight we saddle up for a ride across the Central Asian steppe. Wind whipping against your cheeks, hooves drumming the earth like distant thunder. The sky yawns open in all directions. No trees, no shadows, and definitely no bathrooms. You're astride a short, stocky Mongol pony, with more endurance than charm. The smell is something between wet leather, old sheep, and boiled milk. The leather straps dig into your thighs. Your boots are starting to stick to the stirrups. And there's something you ate that is definitely threatening mutiny. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you all listen in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean forward slightly, adjusting your position on the saddle. Not for comfort, mind you, because comfort left this expedition about 3 hours ago. You're doing it to avoid bruising your tailbone any further. That saddle isn't padded. Mongol warriors used a wooden frame with a leather covering, and maybe a little felt, if they were lucky. It's built for stability and combat, not your rear end. As the pony trots forward, you realize how far away from anything resembling modern civilization you really are. No signposts. No plumbing. No cafe with emergency bathrooms. Just the wind, your horse, your growling stomach, and that creeping dread that something fermented is moving in your belly. The Mongols were masters of the long haul. They could ride for hours, sometimes entire days, without dismounting. They ate in the saddle, drank in the saddle, and yes, according to some accounts, relieved themselves in the saddle. This wasn't just bravado, it was strategy. A single rider could cover up to 100 miles in a day. Their endurance came not from comfort, but from stubborn necessity. The landscape was unforgiving. Stopping meant vulnerability. You might step off to relieve yourself and find an arrow waiting in the grass. So they trained to endure. And they suffered in ways modern folks in climate-controlled offices can barely imagine. It's not just about physical stamina. It's about discipline. These warriors conditioned themselves to ignore bodily urges. Their diet helped too, though not necessarily in a good way. Fermented horse milk, kumis, dried meat strips, and occasional blood drained from live animals, don't worry, we'll get there, meant your digestive system moved slower than your horse's hooves. You shift again. The sun beats down. Your saddle squeaks. You pass a cluster of other riders, all silent, all focused, all clearly pretending they don't urgently need to use the bathroom. There's no privacy. The Mongol steppe offers no trees to duck behind, no outhouses, and definitely no charm. If you have to go, everyone's going to know. Historians still argue whether Mongol warriors truly stayed mounted for everything, or whether that's an exaggerated myth passed down by enemies, stunned by their endurance. But what's certain is this: they made stopping as rare as possible. They believed in speed, surprise, and sheer stubbornness. And yes, they believed the weak could be weeded out by a little indigestion. You glance down at your saddlebag. Inside, your provisions include a lump of dried goat meat and something that might have been cheese, but now resembles an old eraser. You sigh. You chew anyway. You regret it instantly. Your horse doesn't care. It plods forward, patient and tireless, with the blank indifference of a creature that's seen far too many humans try to act tough. You wonder how many others have sat in this saddle bouncing along the steppe with clenched jaws and clenched other things. The air is dry. The wind tastes faintly of dust and sheep. You realize you haven't had water in hours. You also realize this is probably on purpose. So you press forward. There's no stopping, not unless you're ready to explain yourself in front of a dozen stone-faced riders who've all made the same choice. Discomfort over danger. Your horse whinnies. Somewhere behind you, another rider lets out a laugh. Short, dry, and definitely aimed at you. Maybe they saw your face. Maybe they know what's coming. Maybe they remember their first ride. The first time kumis hit at the wrong hour. The first time they discovered that there are no bathroom breaks in the Mongol horde. And now, so do you. The trousers, if you can call them that, are the first real clue that no one in this culture expected comfort. They're loose in the leg, tight at the ankle, and strangely open at the top. Perfect for mounting a pony, not so perfect for keeping anything out. They're usually made from wool or felted camel hair, depending on what part of the steppe you're in. And there's no fly, no buttons, just a drawstring. The whole design screams, fast on, fast off, if you dare. You shift uncomfortably again, the fabric chafing where it probably shouldn't. There's no underwear. Mongols didn't layer like you might think. Multiple shirts, yes, good for sweat absorption, but nothing close to briefs. The freedom was essential for mobility, but it came with exposure. Riding for hours in these pants means friction, grit, and wind, where you really don't want wind. And yet, this style had its benefits. These pants weren't made for standing around a marketplace. They were designed for one thing, moving fast. You don't just wear them, you adapt to them. The wide gusset, the open hips, they all allow you to straddle a horse without pinching, pulling, or binding. A knight in chainmail couldn't sit like this without needing a blacksmith to unbolt him. You, on the other hand, are practically built into your pony now. Mongol clothing was functional to the point of cruelty. And while some early travelers mistook it for sloppiness, it was actually engineering. Layers could be stripped off quickly if the weather shifted, which it often did, and wrapped around the body again in seconds. But none of this helped with the bigger issue at hand. Nature calls. You start wondering, as most riders must have, how exactly you'd go about answering that call without taking off everything. The answer: you don't. You either hold it, or you live with the consequences. And Mongols were very good at living with consequences. Historians still argue whether these trousers were ever modified for long campaigns, whether there were slits cut discreetly for relief, or whether that's just wishful thinking on the part of modern reenactors trying to survive a weekend in Mongolia. Some say special riding garments were designed with an open back. Others insist there was no such luxury, and the sheer threat of battle or dishonor kept your bladder in check. You bounce slightly in the saddle as the pony navigates a shallow rut. The impact drives the waistband of your pants into your ribs. That would be manageable if not for the creeping realization that the fermented milk from earlier may not be settling well. You try to ignore it. You glance over and see a fellow rider, completely unfazed. His clothes are stiff with dust, his posture perfect, and his expression neutral. He doesn't fidget, he doesn't squirm, he is one with the saddle. You wonder what he knows that you don't. Then it dawns on you. Practice. These riders grew up like this. Little boys barely tall enough to mount a goat were being tossed onto ponies and sent off to chase foxes. They learned early on to manage every bodily function on horseback. They learned when to drink, when to eat, and when to simply clench and pray. The trousers were part of the ritual. You wore them not because they were comfortable, but because they reminded you that you were never meant to relax. Comfort was for the dead. Or the Chinese. You spot a yurt in the distance. Smoke curls from its chimney, promising warmth, soft bedding, and maybe, just maybe, a place to sit down properly. But it's too far, and you're not allowed to break formation. The riders around you shift as one, a flock of silent endurance. No one speaks. No one complains. They've all accepted the same truth. If you stop for pants-related reasons, you might not catch up. A joke floats through your mind, something about Mongol trousers being the original athleisure wear. It doesn't help. You shift again, trying to find a new angle where the wool isn't rubbing against the same spot it has been for 6 straight hours. You fail. You are living a slow-motion tragedy in felt. And the worst part? You've still got at least another 40 miles to go. You reach for your water skin, not because you're thirsty, but because your stomach is starting to bubble in that ominous, pre-revolt kind of way. You unstopper the mouth and take a cautious sip. The sour, slightly fizzy tang hits instantly. Yep, it's kumis again. Fermented mare's milk, beloved by steppe nomads, feared by everyone else. It's cloudy, pungent, and somehow both sour and slightly alcoholic. You wince. It's like drinking yogurt through a sock someone wore to run a marathon. But this stuff fuels empires. Literally. Kumis wasn't just a beverage. It was survival. Rich in calories, light on solid waste, and easy to churn while on the move, it was the drink of choice for Mongol riders. Every camp had its supply, every horse provided, and unfortunately, every gut reacted a little differently. You suppress a burp. The fizziness of kumis comes from natural fermentation, and that process is less precise than you might hope. Sometimes it's mildly tangy. Other times it's explosive, and your intestines, having enjoyed decades of pasteurized calm, are now staging a protest. The gurgling deepens. You shift in the saddle and try to pretend everything is fine. Kumis was traditionally kept in leather bags, airy, musky, often sloshing at your side while you rode. Some accounts suggest these bags were hung in tents and stirred with sticks to speed fermentation. Others claim they were tied to saddles and shaken while galloping. A kind of warrior smoothie. The Mongols believed kumis had health benefits. It provided essential nutrients, especially in a land where fresh vegetables were rare and meat had the texture of bark. It was also seen as slightly intoxicating, which meant it could relax both body and mind. Unfortunately, it also relaxed other things. You squeeze the saddle with your thighs and think firm thoughts. Historians still argue over the exact role kumis played in military endurance. Did it really keep riders full and energized, or did they simply tolerate it because there were no other options? Some records from visiting Persian emissaries describe the drink as unclean and smelling of death. Others begrudgingly admitted its effectiveness. Your own body is less forgiving. The churn intensifies. You breathe through your nose and try to distract yourself. Think of horses. Think of the clouds. Think of anything but your lower intestine. Your horse snorts. You can't tell if it's sympathy or mockery. Probably both. Kumis wasn't just a drink, it was a rhythm. Riders passed it among themselves, sharing from the same skin. There was no time for manners. If your throat was dry, you drank. If your stomach flipped, you just kept riding. A true warrior didn't stop for cramps. He powered through them. But you're not a true warrior. You're a very modern person with very modern regrets, like agreeing to this ride in the first place, like trusting your gut. The man beside you takes a deep gulp from his own bag. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't even blink. His stomach must be lined with leather. You wonder how long it takes to build that kind of tolerance. Years, probably. And several unfortunate incidents. One traveler in the 13th century claimed that kumis made his ears ring. Another said it caused him to lose feeling in his legs. These accounts are often dismissed as exaggeration, but as your stomach lets out a groan like a dying camel, you're starting to believe them. You try to breathe slowly. You focus on the landscape, the dry, endless steppe, the waving grasses, the distant blur of another cavalry unit galloping with the fluidity of a school of fish. No one stops. No one lags. They all just ride. You start to understand something deeper about the Mongols. They weren't just fast because of horses. They were fast because of fear. Fear of falling behind, of missing your moment, of being the weak link. And Kumis, for all its stomach-turning flaws, was part of that relentless momentum. You take another sip. You almost gag. You keep going. At some point, the discomfort becomes normal. You stop thinking about the pressure in your gut. You stop hoping for relief. You just ride. And then a terrible giddy thought occurs to you. This is only day one. There's something you learn very quickly while bouncing around the steppes on a Mongol saddle. It is absolutely not designed for leisure. It's shaped like a miniature torture device. At first glance, you'd think it's missing something essential, like cushioning. And you'd be right. Mongol saddles were built for durability and control, not for your posterior's comfort. They featured a high front and back, technically called the pommel and cantle, which meant you didn't slide around much. That's good when you're firing arrows at full gallop. It's less good when you're just trying not to rupture a kidney. You settle back, trying to lean against the cantle for support. Instead, it digs into your lower spine like an unyielding fist. You try shifting forward, but the pommel jabs your stomach. There is no middle ground. There is only pain, minor readjustments, and growing numbness. Historians still argue whether Mongol riders stuffed anything under themselves to make these saddles bearable. Some evidence points to sheepskin or folded felt, but hard proof is scarce. Most agree that once your body was conditioned, you just stopped noticing the ache. That, or you simply learned to accept that dull, constant soreness was part of life, like saddle sores or fermented horse milk. And let's talk about the saddle itself. It's wooden, usually two curved boards secured over the horse's back, bound with leather and sinew. No steel stirrups, no fancy embellishments, just something that looks like a high school woodworking project with sharp corners. But it works. The shape lets you stand slightly while riding, essential for blood flow and archery, but it also traps you in place for hours. You glance at your feet. Your legs are braced in stirrups that hang high, higher than you're used to. That means your knees are bent tightly, held in one position for far too long. Your thighs are burning. Your back is tight. And worst of all, you feel something alarming. Your feet are going numb. Fantastic. The horse, of course, is fine. Mongol ponies were selected for their toughness, not their empathy. They could ride all day, eat almost nothing, and sleep standing up. They're also shorter than most modern horses, meaning your knees are practically level with your chest. It's not exactly graceful. You shift again. A faint pop comes from your hip. You're now officially one with the saddle. Welcome to the life of the Golden Horde. This setup made Mongol riders nearly impossible to unseat. In battle, they were like centaurs, half human, half horse, all discomfort. They could twist, fire, reload, and signal, all while at full gallop. And they did it all on these bone-jarring saddles. And yes, they did it while desperately needing to pee. There's no getting around it. You can't quickly jump off this thing. Not without risk. Not without fumbling with layers of robes, boots, and that cursed drawstring. And so most riders chose the obvious route. They just didn't. It's rumored that some trained themselves to relieve themselves without dismounting. Others simply waited. Some might have found corners of battlefields if such corners existed, and risked being speared mid-squat. But overall, the evidence points to one universal truth. These saddles were not meant for breaks. You remember reading about a general who claimed he rode for 72 hours straight. His legs had to be lifted from the stirrups. He couldn't walk for a full day. You used to think that was impressive. Now, you just wonder what his pants looked like. Another bounce, another jolt, another reason to reconsider your life choices. And yet, somehow, Mongol warriors made it work. They were feared not just for their tactics or ruthlessness, but for their sheer endurance. They kept moving when others stopped. They endured when others complained, and their saddles, for all their cruelty, were part of the reason why. You squint at the horizon. Still flat, still distant, still offering absolutely no privacy. Your back aches, your legs tremble, and still you ride. Because getting off this saddle might hurt more than staying on. You consider, for just a moment, throwing yourself off the horse and sprinting into the grasses. Maybe you could find a shallow ditch or a merciful shadow to crouch under. But then you remember what everyone in the horde remembers. Stepping off your horse could get you killed. It's not paranoia, it's protocol. Stopping, especially alone, made you vulnerable to all the things the Mongol steppe had to offer. Enemy scouts, wolves, hostile locals, and perhaps most terrifying of all, your own comrades catching you in the act and never letting you live it down. There's a tale, half joke, half warning, that young recruits were once punished not for losing a battle, but for dismounting to relieve themselves during one. The message was clear. You don't stop for your bladder when history's being written, so you stay put. You try to suppress the bubbling dread inside. You clench in ways you didn't know were possible. You remind yourself that pride is apparently stronger than digestive distress. The Mongol way of war was designed for momentum. Ambushes, flanking maneuvers, fast retreats. It all depended on constant movement. If one man stopped, others might have to wait. And that meant the entire strategy could fail. That's why riders were trained not to stop for anything. Not hunger, not thirst, and certainly not the call of nature. Historians still argue over how strictly this was enforced. Some claim that entire units would dismount together at designated moments. Others suggest that such luxury was rare, especially in enemy territory. In those moments, they simply endured, or, if whispers are to be believed, found creative solutions involving spare cloth or boots. Yes, boots. You glance nervously at your own boots. They're snug, weather-worn, and suddenly suspicious. Could they be dual purpose? You're not sure you want to know. There's also the matter of wolves. Real, actual wolves. You've heard stories, plenty of them, from elders who claimed that stepping into the wrong patch of tall grass alone was like ringing a dinner bell. Wolves would sometimes trail Mongol armies, waiting for the injured, the weak, or the foolish. To crouch and drop your guard was to become prey. So no, you don't stop. Even now, centuries later, when you're just imagining it from the comfort of your modern home or your cozy bed, the thought of squatting in open territory while an army rolls by is deeply unsettling. And it wasn't just the predators outside the camp, it was the social ones too. Mongol warriors were notoriously harsh with one another. Shame was a powerful disciplinary tool. Falling off your horse was bad. Fumbling with your robes and missing a charge? Unforgivable. There are accounts, always second-hand, always murky, of a young archer named Temujin who stopped behind a dune during a patrol. He never lived it down, not because he got ambushed, not because he was injured. but because the rest of his unit kept riding, and he had to gallop after them mid-adjustment. They gave him a nickname that translated loosely as "squats on sentry." He was still being called that years later. You feel for him. You look ahead. The unit continues, silent and tireless. Dust billows behind the lead riders. You spot someone at the far left of the group, lifting himself ever so slightly in the stirrups, maybe stretching, maybe not. It's impossible to tell. The secrecy, the denial, it's part of the code. Because in the Mongol army, you were expected to be a rider first and a human being second. You close your eyes briefly, the jostling of the saddle blending into the rhythm of the horse. You count your breaths. You remind yourself that it's not forever, just until the next camp. Just until the next stretch of flat land is behind you. But you know, deep down, the next stretch will look exactly like this one. And the horse isn't stopping. There are no leaves out here, no soft moss, no soothing streams. If you need to clean yourself after doing the unspeakable, you're not reaching for a pack of wet wipes. You're reaching for pebbles. Yes. Pebbles, or snowballs, depending on the season. The Mongol steppe, while vast and majestic, is not especially charitable when it comes to personal hygiene. It offers hard ground, rough grasses, and wind that makes everything dry out faster than your dignity. And when nature called, you made do with what you could find. Stones, scraps of cloth, dried grass if you were lucky. Sometimes you just didn't. You shift in your saddle again. Your thighs feel raw. Your lower back has been humming with a low ache for an hour now. And that kumis continues its gentle but firm protest in your gut. You try not to imagine having to resolve this with a pocketful of gravel and an audience of several thousand warriors. Historians still argue about exactly what the Mongols used for sanitation. Written records are sparse on this topic, either because it was considered unworthy of chronicling, or because even the scribes didn't want to think about it. One Chinese envoy, writing from a Mongol court in the 13th century, made a passing reference to cleaning with smooth stones, but didn't elaborate. You can't blame him. Archaeological digs at old Mongol encampments have found remnants of leather scraps and ash pits, suggesting that some level of sanitation existed. But whether that applied on the open steppe during a long march, that's less certain. You try to picture it. A lone rider finally giving in, dismounting behind a hillock, fumbling with layers of wool and trying to maintain balance in wind that seems personally offended by your presence. Then crouching, exposed, cold, aware that every moment brings with it the chance of mockery, ambush, or a surprise cavalry maneuver. And after that ordeal, a stone, cold, smooth, hopefully not jagged. You wonder how one even chooses the right rock. Is there a protocol? Do you test it first? Is there a ranking system, like a Pebble Michelin guide? Your horse snorts. You get the feeling it's laughing. The use of snow, surprisingly, was seen as an upgrade, at least in terms of cleanliness. Of course, it also introduced the issue of freezing contact, but that was a trade-off some were willing to make. A brief shiver is better than ongoing infection. Speaking of which, Mongols were surprisingly healthy, all things considered. Their rugged lifestyle, high-protein diet, and obsession with mobility meant they didn't linger anywhere long enough for bacteria to throw a party. And despite the lack of toilet paper, they somehow avoided mass outbreaks of disease more often than not. Some scholars point to their use of ash as a basic disinfectant. Others claim their high alcohol diet, thanks kumis, kept certain parasites at bay. There's even an ongoing debate about whether Mongol stomach flora had evolved to deal with raw meat and minimal cleaning. The truth. Likely a mix of all of it, and sheer exposure therapy. Still, it doesn't help you now. The thought of a bathroom break has gone from inconvenient to terrifying. There's no good outcome. If you stay in the saddle, you risk disaster. If you dismount, you'll need rocks and judgment. So, like generations of riders before you, you choose endurance. You shift your weight, grit your teeth, and pray to every forgotten sky deity that you make it to camp. A distant camp, hours away, that may or may not have a communal latrine dug out behind a boulder. You wonder how anyone fell asleep in those conditions. Then again, exhaustion can do wonders. So can lowering your standards. The wind picks up, dry and cold, brushing across your face like sandpaper. You swear you hear the faint clatter of stones in your saddlebag and feel a whole new level of discomfort settle in. You are learning what it truly meant to ride with the Mongol horde and what it cost to never stop moving. You're starting to notice something strange about this entire operation. No one smells clean. Not your horse, not your saddle, not the rider next to you, not even the air. It's not rank exactly. It's more like a deep, lingering musk of sweat, leather, dried blood, animal grease, and fermented dairy. You could bottle it and call it eau de steppe, but no one would buy it. And that's because, at a certain point in Mongol history, Genghis Khan outright banned bathing. Yes, banned. Now, to be fair, it wasn't a permanent rule. But according to several sources, during certain seasons, or around sacred days, bathing, especially in running water, was considered taboo. The reason? Water spirits. It was believed that disturbing natural bodies of water might anger the spirits who lived there, and bad luck was the last thing a soldier wanted to carry into battle alongside a bow and half a goat. So you, noble steppe rider that you now are, haven't bathed in, well, let's say too long. Your skin itches. Your clothes are crusted in layers of yesterday. The sweat from this morning has baked into a kind of crunchy shell beneath your wool tunic. You're not even sure where your body ends and your clothing begins. Historians still argue about the extent of Mongol hygiene practices. Some say they were much cleaner than the stereotypes suggest, washing hands and faces regularly with water or even milk. Others insist the dust bath method was preferred, letting wind and sun do the job that soap would handle elsewhere. What's certain is this: if you did get to bathe, it probably involved heating water in a cauldron, carefully ladling it out, and scrubbing down with a handful of horsehair or rough cloth. It wasn't a daily luxury. It was a military strategy to avoid sickness when camped for long periods. But if you were on the move, you didn't clean. You dried. Add to this the diet. Remember the kumis? It doesn't exactly leave you smelling like roses. And the dried meat, preserved in horse fat, had a way of reappearing on your skin via sweat. You're essentially riding through history wearing a slow-cooking stew of goat protein and panic. Which brings us to the most pressing detail: digestion. Bathing may have been rare, but that didn't mean your digestive system got a break. In fact, it worked overtime. The constant intake of fatty meats, milk, and minimal fiber created unique internal environments. You feel it now, a tightness in your abdomen, a pressure that's building like a drumbeat. You grip the saddle horn and pretend you're just enjoying the ride. You are not. You are actively negotiating with your intestines like a hostage situation. And yet, you marvel at how the real Mongol warriors seem to manage it. You've read accounts from Persian travelers and Russian captives, men who were stunned at how Mongol soldiers could endure days without dismounting, eating only what they carried and ignoring all bodily needs. One theory? Genghis Khan's bans weren't just spiritual, they were tactical. Bathing slows you down. Bathing draws attention. Bathing in a world without plumbing creates vulnerability. And the Mongols didn't do vulnerability. You think of a stream you passed hours ago. It sparkled in the sun, just long enough to make your parched skin jealous. But no one turned toward it. No one stopped to wash. The entire unit rolled past like it didn't exist. It probably didn't. For them, it was sacred or off-limits or just not worth it. You scratch your shoulder, then your neck, then, well, you give up and stop scratching because every surface itches and you don't have enough fingers. There is a certain point at which filth becomes meditative. You stop resisting it. You accept the grime, the stench, the greasy slick of days-old sweat as your new state of being. You transcend shame and become part of the landscape. Just another dusty figure moving across a forgotten plain. And as your body rebels and your mind numbs, you realize that maybe, just maybe, this was part of the genius. Strip away comfort, and you strip away distraction. Strip away cleanliness, and you strip away luxury. What's left is pure focus, pure momentum. Pure discomfort-powered conquest. You ride on. You smell like a stable, and regret. But you haven't stopped. And that, here, is what counts. You're trying to ignore the meat in your saddlebag, but it's not easy. It's there. You can smell it. Musty, leathery, oddly sweet. It's not rotting exactly, but it's definitely fermenting in its own special way. This is borts, the Mongol version of dried meat, and your only solid food option today. Again. It comes in thin, brittle strips cut from goat, sheep, or horse. Yes, horse. Don't look at your pony that way. He knows. And he's quietly judging you. You take a bite. It tastes like old jerky, left on a windowsill for 6 months. It doesn't so much dissolve as disintegrate into dry fibers that suck every molecule of moisture out of your mouth. You try to chew. You try to swallow. You start to regret every meal you've ever taken for granted. And yet, it's incredibly efficient. This meat, sliced thin and dried in the wind, could last for months. It weighed almost nothing and packed enough calories to keep a rider moving for days. And most importantly, it didn't spoil. You just snapped off a piece, sucked on it until it softened, and hoped your digestive system was on your side. Spoiler, yours is not. This meat doesn't pass through like a salad or soup. It takes its time. It settles in your stomach like a guest who didn't ask to stay the night, but now insists on rearranging the furniture. Combined with the kumis, it's created a sort of internal tug-of-war between fermentation and fossilization. You burp. The air tastes like regret. Historians still argue how much borts alone could sustain a Mongol warrior. Some say it was a stopgap between hunts or camp meals. Others claim it was the foundation of the mobile diet, light, dense, and dependable. Genghis Khan himself supposedly kept pouches of the stuff at his waist, always ready to snack mid-battle. And it wasn't just meat. Mongol riders also carried little flour cakes called tarag, or small balls of dried curds. Mix those with water, and you had a sort of gritty porridge. Add horse fat if you're feeling fancy, but don't expect it to move through you quickly. That's the problem with dried food. It dries you. Your body, trying to conserve water and process dense, chewy calories, slows down digestion like a cautious tortoise. It's why your stomach has stopped making casual noises and started sending coded distress signals. But there's no stopping. There's no outhouse. There's no squatty trench. So you press on, a human jerky container riding through history. Occasionally, riders would soften their boards by soaking it in broth or mixing it with hot water in a skin pouch strapped to the saddle. But broth requires a fire, and fires require stopping, and stopping. Well, we've been over that, so most just chewed. Slowly, grudgingly, regretfully. There's a joke that goes around the reenactor camps, the kind where history enthusiasts try to live like Mongol warriors for a weekend. It goes, "The meat goes in today and leaves in Mongolia." Everyone laughs nervously. Then they chew in silence. You try another bite, if only to keep your mind off your gut. Your jaw hurts. Your tongue is covered in salt. You wonder how many centuries it would take for your descendants to forgive you for what you're doing to your digestive tract right now. And still, the others ride on. Some are chewing. Some aren't. No one looks uncomfortable. You tell yourself they're faking it. That everyone's in pain. That everyone is quietly wondering if this was a mistake. But you know better. They were born into this. They didn't transition from sandwiches and smoothies. They were weaned on dried milk curds and boiled bone broth. They've never known a food that didn't challenge their intestines to a duel. And in that moment it becomes clear. The Mongol Empire wasn't built on military genius alone. It was built on borts. You try not to think about it, but it's always there. The simple truth that getting off your horse could kill you. Not from the act itself, of course. Dismounting is easy enough. Swing a leg, slide down, hope your knees still work. But it's what comes after that's risky. When you're no longer part of the moving organism that is the cavalry, you're exposed. Alone. Vulnerable. And if you're seen squatting behind a hill or fiddling with your trousers during a sudden ambush, well, good luck explaining that to the afterlife. This is why Mongol warriors trained themselves to stay in the saddle no matter what. They ate, slept, and sometimes even died in those saddles. You've read that they could do almost anything while riding, drink, communicate using flag signals, even switch horses without stopping. But one detail always sticks in your head. Some say they even relieved themselves without ever dismounting. You don't want to believe it. You really don't. But the logic holds. When you're riding through enemy territory, or when your commander is planning a perfectly timed, multi-pronged assault across rivers and ridgelines, there's no room for, "Hey, hold up, guys. I gotta pee." No time for digging a trench or seeking privacy. You imagine it now. A slight shift in the saddle, a tug at the trousers, a subtle lean to the side, and then continuing to ride like nothing happened. Horrifying. Yes, impressive, also yes. Historians still argue over how literal these accounts are. Did Mongol warriors really go that far? Or are these just wild exaggerations from enemy scribes trying to make them sound both terrifying and disgusting? Maybe a little of both. But it's no stretch to believe they adapted themselves, physically and mentally, to avoid stopping at all costs. And then there's the cold. During winter campaigns, getting off your horse meant subjecting yourself to wind that could freeze your exposed skin in seconds. Some say frostbite took more lives than arrows. In that context, the idea of staying mounted, handling everything, while seated, starts to make more sense, or at least it becomes less crazy than the alternative. You've heard the story of a scout who was ambushed mid-squat. He had dismounted to relieve himself behind a cluster of rocks and didn't see the enemy patrol approaching. His comrades found him moments later, still half-dressed, his expression permanently frozen in surprise. After that, no one dismounted alone again, ever. You think of your own situation now, how long you've been riding, how much pressure is building, how numb your legs have become. It's not just discomfort anymore. It's endurance training. It's spiritual. It's like meditation, but with more abdominal tension. And yet, the ride continues. Always forward. You try to distract yourself. You focus on your horse's ears flicking back and forth, the steady clop of hooves, the rhythmic squeak of worn leather. You look around. Everyone else appears unfazed, perhaps a little grimy, a little sunburned, but calm. This might be your 100th moment of desperation today. For them, it's just Wednesday. This level of resilience didn't happen overnight. From childhood, Mongol boys were taught to ride, shoot, and ignore discomfort. They were encouraged to toughen their bodies and silence their complaints. The steppe itself was their school, wide, barren, indifferent to your needs. You start to understand why they were so feared. It wasn't just their tactics. It wasn't just their speed. It was their complete control over their own bodies. The refusal to stop, to show weakness, to allow biology to override mission. You grip the reins tighter. You clench in solidarity. The wind picks up again. You squint ahead. The horizon remains maddeningly unchanged, and still you ride. As the sun starts to tilt westward, you spot a line of yurts in the far distance. Soft, rounded shapes dotting the steppe like pale mushrooms. Smoke curls from one or two of them, carrying the smell of boiled meat and burning dung. You almost cry. Because yurts, or gurs, meant shelter. Not comfort exactly, but shelter. And crucially, if you were lucky, a moment to dismount. A moment to take care of business somewhere that wasn't moving, vibrating, and actively trying to unseat your soul. As you ride closer, the details emerge. Felted wool, wrapped tight around a wooden lattice, low doors facing south to shield from the northern winds, and smoke holes at the top belching out the results of dubious cooking experiments. One yurt has a saddle hanging from a peg outside. Another has a spear planted firmly in the ground next to it, and none of them, unfortunately, have an outhouse. You'd been hoping for some kind of pit, or maybe a wooden box with a curtain. But no. You are reminded once again, this is not a medieval spa retreat. Inside the yurt, waste was handled in the simplest way possible, by not handling it at all. Mongols rarely relieved themselves inside these sacred spaces. The yurt was for sleeping, cooking, storytelling, and occasionally birthing a foal right next to your bedding. Bodily functions. Outside, and outside meant the endless steppe again. Some families designated a spot behind their yurt for relief, usually downwind, behind a small screen of brush if you were lucky. But even then, it wasn't a proper latrine. You'd squat, do your best, and maybe cover it with a sprinkle of ash or earth. Sanitation was a team sport, and the team was usually your boots. Historians still debate the specifics of Mongol camp hygiene. There are reports from Persian diplomats who were astounded by the organization of the camps, how each yurt had a place, how the carts formed concentric circles, how even waste had zones. But they also complained of the smell, the flies, and the lack of designated zones for certain activities. You ride past the outer edge of the encampment. Riders are dismounting. Horses are being rubbed down, fed, and watered. You slide off your saddle like a sack of flour tipping off a cart. Your knees wobble. Your thighs scream. Your stomach makes a noise that can only be described as legally actionable. You hobble toward the edge of the camp. No one looks at you. No one acknowledges your obvious distress. In Mongol culture, bodily needs were private, silent, and definitely not discussed. The more you pretended you didn't have them, the more respect you earned. You find a low ridge, turn your back to the camp, and finally, let nature take its course. It is not a triumphant moment. There are no angelic choirs. There is only wind and dust and the faint sound of someone nearby also trying not to make eye contact. You fumble through your pouch for something to clean with. You find a rag, or possibly an old saddlecloth. It will do. It must do. The relief is immediate and overwhelming. But so is the discomfort. You realize that there is no clean place to stand, no fresh water to wash with. You are, essentially, part of the dirt now. Still, it's done. You straighten up, tie your sash, and limp back to camp with the grim satisfaction of someone who has survived something unspeakable. You've just had your first real Mongol rider's experience, and you get the feeling it won't be your last. The yurt awaits. You duck through the low door and are hit with a wave of smoke and mutton. A bowl of stew is thrust into your hands by someone who nods once and says nothing. You sit cross-legged on a thin rug, careful not to lean too far in any direction, and accept your fate. Because this is the life, fast, filthy, and full of fermented everything. You take a bite of stew. It's mostly fat. Of course it is. Outside, the horses whinny, the sun dips lower, and the wind scrapes across the steppe like sandpaper. You wonder idly if anyone has ever truly gotten used to this. Then you realize they have. And now maybe, so have you. You wake up the next morning with a back like splintered wood and a throat that feels like it's been scrubbed with wool. The yurt is dim, full of soft breathing, half-burned dung smoldering in the central hearth, and the vague smoky tang of something you hope isn't goat intestines. But nature is calling again. Of course it is. You hesitate. Maybe you can wait. Maybe you can ride it out. Then you remember. You have to ride it out, literally. You shuffle outside, blinking into the sunrise, only to realize, again, there is nowhere to go. Not unless you count a slight dip in the ground behind someone's firewood pile. Someone else is already squatting there, making hard eye contact with the horizon and pretending you don't exist. Privacy, as a concept, simply doesn't exist out here. That's something many travelers to Mongol territory recorded with surprise. Persians, Chinese emissaries, even Franciscan monks commented on it. Their manner of relieving themselves is public, shameless, and swift, one baffled envoy wrote. But that's not entirely fair. Mongols didn't enjoy public elimination. They simply didn't see it as worth making a fuss over. You duck behind a cart and do what must be done, grateful at least for the morning chill, which keeps the smell bearable and the flies asleep. Then, after a few grunts, muttered regrets, and a boot shuffle that probably qualifies as cleaning up, you return to camp. No one speaks of what just happened. No one ever will. Historians still argue over the extent of Mongol social rules around modesty. Some sources suggest they were surprisingly prudish in domestic spaces. Men and women had separate zones in the yurt, and elders were respected with rigid formality. But out on campaign, that was different. On the steppe, the line between personal and public blurred fast. You mount your horse with a wince. Everything's sore. Your thighs feel like beef strips. You're not even sure your hips are still attached. And you've begun to understand something deeper. This wasn't just survival. It was a performance. To the Mongols, endurance was a kind of honor theater. You didn't complain because complaint was weakness, and nothing was more shameful than weakness. Even Genghis Khan himself reportedly upheld a brutal kind of stoicism. His army rules were unambiguous. Disobedience, laziness, or anything that slowed the march could earn you lashes. Or worse, if you fell behind because your bowels betrayed you. Well, you better hope you're fast with that saddlebag. Your stomach grumbles again. The stew from last night is staging a quiet rebellion. You pat your belt, adjust your trousers, and try to convince yourself you can make it through another day without incident. It's wishful thinking. You glance sideways at another rider, a man maybe 50, with a long braid and a bow strapped across his back. He doesn't squirm, doesn't shift, just stares ahead like he's merged with his mount. You wonder if he's ever had to scramble behind a cart in desperation. You decide, probably not. Or if he did it without anyone noticing. As the cavalry begins to move again, you find yourself automatically adjusting your posture to avoid pressure on certain sensitive areas. Your whole body aches. You smell like campfire, sweat, and shame. But you're riding. And in this strange, dust-blown world, that's what matters. There's a strange camaraderie to it, too. No one talks about the discomfort, but everyone feels it. You pass a young rider shifting awkwardly in his saddle. Your eyes meet briefly. No words, just a shared moment of silent misery and respect. The wind picks up again, brisk, cold, with that faint smell of livestock that never leaves. It flutters the hems of your tunic, kicks up dust, and reminds you that you are very far from porcelain toilets and scented soaps. But you're here. You're riding with the horde. You haven't been left behind. You haven't disgraced yourself. Not yet. And as the sun climbs higher and the miles stretch endlessly ahead, you begin to accept a difficult truth. There will be no privacy. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not for as long as you're a part of this ever-moving, never-pausing, fully functional cavalry machine. You tighten your reins, shift again, and whisper to yourself the 3 words every rider learns eventually. Just hold on. You've been riding for hours again, and you're starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Mongols had a secret you've missed. Some hidden trick, some clever invention. Because surely no one survives this much bouncing, jostling, and holding it in without some kind of system. And then the rumor comes back to you, the one no one wants to believe. Did they wear diapers? Not the kind you know, not the soft, disposable ones with cartoon animals and elastic seams. We're talking wool, or felt, or padded leather. Something absorbent, something you could strap on and forget about until you couldn't. It sounds ridiculous at first. But the more you ride, the more it makes sense. What if, instead of stopping, instead of risking your life behind a rock, you just went, and then dealt with it later, at camp in the privacy of your own shame? It's a theory some historians take seriously. While no physical evidence of Mongol diapers has survived, unsurprisingly, since used wool pads don't exactly fossilize well, some scholars point to ambiguous descriptions in Chinese and Persian texts. Phrases like absorbent wrappings or inner cloths changed often could mean anything. But in this context, they become very suggestive. You shift again, now suspicious of the slightly bulkier tunic the rider next to you is wearing. Is that just extra felt for warmth or something else? You'll never know. You'll never ask. Because the shame of asking might be worse than the act itself. And let's be honest, they had the materials. Felt was abundant, made from compressed sheep's wool. It was warm, flexible, and used for everything from clothing to yurt walls. A couple of layers tucked strategically could work in a pinch. Uncomfortable? Definitely. But better than digging a pit in enemy territory while arrows start flying. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just a desperate solution for extreme cases, like scouts on long patrols or messengers making 100-mile rides. But even if it wasn't common, it was possible. And in Mongol logic, possible usually meant expected. It fits the larger pattern too. Mongols were incredibly pragmatic. They didn't let pride get in the way of survival. They ate raw liver because it was fast, They stitched wounds with horsehair because it worked. And if wrapping your dignity in wool meant you could finish a raid without losing momentum, you probably did it. You glance at your own saddlebag again. There's dried meat. A half-empty kumis skin. A length of cloth that suddenly looks like it might serve a darker purpose than drying your hands. The idea sticks in your head like a burr. What if this is the unspoken secret of Mongol endurance? What if behind every stoic expression was a man quietly hoping his padding held out? The silence among riders starts to feel suspicious. Is everyone else doing it? Are you the only one still suffering? The sun rises higher. The steppe ripples with dry grass. You ride past a pile of horse dung that seems disturbingly human in shape. You try not to think about it. One account from a Russian prisoner of war described the interior of a Mongol camp as rank with old clothes and cloths heavy with waste. He didn't elaborate, and maybe he didn't want to. Maybe some secrets aren't meant to be written down. But the more you ride, the more you understand. This wasn't about comfort. This was about continuity. Momentum. Discipline so absolute, even your bathroom breaks bowed before it. You clench your reins, shift in your saddle, and try not to think about your options. Because the steppe is wide, the yurts are far, and the next stop, hours away. You've now been riding for what feels like an entire century. Your thighs are numb. Your tailbone has its own personal vendetta. And your stomach, well, your stomach has entered a state of existential reflection. But there's still one more twist to this digestive drama: the ride itself. Because as it turns out, galloping for hours on end does something special to the human body. Your organs bounce. This isn't poetic imagery. This is biomechanical fact. When you're strapped into a Mongol saddle, which offers almost zero shock absorption, and you're trotting, cantering, or galloping across uneven terrain, your insides start to play a game of pinball in a burlap sack. And no one wins. Modern riders know this. Marathon jockeys, endurance racers, even some military horseback units, all report the same thing. Prolonged riding without breaks causes what some politely call gut agitation. Others call it something more vivid, like internal smoothie mode. And Mongol warriors, they did it for days. You can feel it now. Every bump sends a ripple through your midsection. Your intestines are trying to find rhythm in chaos. The dried meat you ate earlier has begun a reluctant migration south. The kumis bubbles in rebellion. And you're doing everything in your power to not shift your weight, because you know exactly how that story ends. This is where the so-called galloping gut theory comes in. A term whispered half seriously in academic circles and fully seriously among people who've ever tried riding 20 miles after fermented dairy. The theory suggests that long-distance horseback riding was itself a kind of digestive timer. After a certain number of miles, your system would demand a break, regardless of battlefield etiquette or personal shame. Historians still argue whether Mongols saw this as a problem or just another test. Some believe they trained for it, learning to brace their cores, regulate breathing, even time their meals based on how their horses moved. Others think it was pure stoicism. They just suffered through it, because suffering was a given. You experiment with shifting slightly forward. Bad idea. Now your kidneys feel like they're doing jazz percussion. You lean back. Worse. Your spine might file a lawsuit. One chronicler claimed that some Mongol riders used tightly wrapped belts to hold their bellies in place during rough rides. Another wrote about soldiers who gritted their teeth and sat atop fire, which sounds like a metaphor, until you realize it might not be. You grip the saddle horn and focus on the horizon. The step is so flat, so endless, that it feels like you're never moving at all, and yet every bounce reminds you otherwise. It's the cruelest kind of illusion: motion without progress, discomfort without destination. Your horse, of course, is completely unaffected. Mongol ponies were bred for this. Their gait is short, steady, and utterly unapologetic. They don't care about your gut. They care about grass, forward momentum, and occasionally kicking each other in the ribs. You glance around. The other riders are focused, silent, and definitely not clutching their sides like you are. You suspect at least 3 of them are pretending not to notice your slow descent into gastrointestinal chaos. You breathe deeply. You try to meditate. You repeat a mantra in your head. Don't think about it. Don't think about it. You think about it, and yet somehow you stay on, because getting off means stopping. And stopping means shame, vulnerability, and the very real possibility that someone will nickname you something like Rumbles in Saddle for the rest of your life. So you endure, because that's what Mongol riders did. They endured the bouncing, the bruises, the burps, and the bowel drama. They learned to time their diets, their movements, even their bladder urges, to the rhythm of the horse beneath them. You're not there yet, but you're learning, one uncomfortable bounce at a time. There's a moment, brief and confusing, when you watch a rider dismount quickly, walk to the edge of the group, and nothing happens. He just stands there, facing away. His hands are at his sides. He doesn't move. And then, as quickly as he stopped, he gets back on his horse and continues riding. You blink. Was that it? It takes you a moment to realize. He didn't dismount to relieve himself. He dismounted to observe. But it triggers a fresh thought, one that's been festering in the corners of your saddle-warped mind. Why don't horses seem to have this problem? They eat constantly. They drink whenever water's available. And yet, they do their business casually, mid-trot, mid-gallop, mid-anything. No guilt, no ceremony. Just a flick of the tail and a moment of release. You begin to envy your horse. There's even evidence that some Mongol warriors studied this behavior. It's said they admired the horse's ability to manage its needs without breaking stride. There's a possibility, whispered in scattered travelogues, that some riders tried to imitate it, to time their own moments to match the rhythm of the ride, to blend it into the movement so smoothly no one could tell. The idea makes you queasy, but also curious. Historians still debate whether Mongols genuinely tried to train themselves to go on the move, or if this is just a myth born from the awe of outside observers. A few surviving battlefield reports describe no breaks, no pause, no disorder, even over multi-day rides. It's not hard to imagine that some soldiers, especially messengers or scouts, had no choice but to master the art of motion relief. There's an old joke, often told among historians who've spent too long in the archives, that goes, "What's faster than a Mongol courier? His lunch coming back to check on him." You laugh, then stop, because your stomach just did something alarming. You brace again, pressing into the saddle as if pressure alone can hold your insides in check. Your horse snorts in protest. And then you think about it more seriously. What would it take to go on the move? First, balance. You'd need to stay seated, or at least in the stirrups, without wobbling. Second, coordination. You'd have to manage your clothing mid-ride, without tangling yourself or your reins. And third, ego, or lack thereof. Because everyone would know. Even if they didn't say a word, they'd know. And yet, in the context of a war march, What's more shameful, letting go with grace, or falling behind and compromising the entire unit? The Mongol answer was clear. You don't stop. You adapt. You imagine the technique. A shift to one side, a loosened sash, a carefully timed moment while crossing a stream or trotting through tall grass. Maybe a strategic splash of water afterward. Maybe not. One account from a captured Russian soldier noted that the smell of their army was known long before their arrows arrived. He probably meant the smell of horses and cooking fires. Probably. But a small part of you suspects otherwise. You realize something unsettling. Mongol horses are rarely spooked by bodily functions. They don't flinch when a rider shifts suddenly. They don't rear when the air gets weird. They've been through it, all of it. Maybe they even expect it. You look down at yours. It looks back at you. There is no judgment in its eyes, only the cold, dead stare of a creature who has seen worse. And in that moment you understand. This is what the horse is for. Not just speed, not just battle, support. In every possible way, you grip the reins with new respect. You're not alone on this journey. You have a companion, one who doesn't mind if things happen. You begin noticing something subtle now, something you wouldn't have paid attention to before. No one is drinking, not in the group riding ahead of you, not among the riders to your left and right. You've been bouncing along under a sky that's turned from cobalt to blazing white, and yet not a single water skin has come out. No one has taken a swig. No one so much as licked their lips. It dawns on you, slowly and with a touch of dread. They're doing this on purpose. They're staying thirsty to avoid having to pee. It's not the glamorous side of war, but it's the strategic one. In order to maintain speed, Mongol warriors often chose deliberate dehydration over awkward, risky stops. It wasn't necessarily healthy. It wasn't heroic, but it was practical. You remember the kumis? Yes, technically hydrating, but also very motivational in the wrong direction. So riders rationed even that, water, saved for emergencies or shared among horses first. After all, horses were the machines of the empire. You were the accessory. Historians still argue whether Mongols trained themselves to endure long periods without water, or whether they simply limited intake to an extreme. There are accounts of soldiers riding for 2 days without stopping to drink, chewing on small lumps of dried curds to distract their mouths. Others suggest they ate less salty food during long campaigns to avoid water retention, or rather, water needs. In practice, the result was a kind of controlled thirst. You sip just enough to survive. You don't gulp. You don't slosh your insides with liquid that will betray you 3 miles later. You manage yourself like a machine. You glance at your own water skin. It's heavy, tempting. The leather creaks under your fingers, but the weight in your bladder, the one you've been suppressing since dawn, is still fresh in your memory. Nope. Not yet. You look around and start to appreciate the sheer discipline of the unit. Dozens of men, all mounted, all quiet, all operating under the same internal rules. Nobody wants to be the one who breaks formation, who stumbles off into the grass, who earns a smirk or worse, a nickname. Because you will be remembered, and the social pressure is worse than the physical one. You've heard tales of nicknames handed down for years, even generations. Dribbles, two-stop, river belly. Not cruel exactly, just persistent. A reminder that in this culture, your ability to suppress personal need was part of your status. A general once supposedly refused water for an entire siege. When asked why, he said, "If I drink, I must stop. If I stop, I delay death for my men. Let them drink." The story might be apocryphal, but it stuck. You can't help wondering how many others pushed themselves to the brink not for glory, but for bladder control. There's also a practical benefit. Dehydration, in moderation, can slow digestion. Less fluid intake means fewer bathroom needs, less chance of mid-ride disaster. It's not a long-term solution, but for a 1 or 2 day campaign, it's effective. You shift again, feeling a slight pinch in your side. Your body's catching on, it's conserving. You're sweating less. Your mouth is dry. You are slowly, painfully, becoming a proper Mongol rider. Your horse doesn't notice. It plods along steadily, sniffing at the breeze, possibly searching for a patch of grass or a puddle. You feel bad. You've been given water, but not your mount. You lean forward and whisper a quiet apology. At the next stop, if there is one, you'll both drink. But until then, you join the silent pact. No water, no weakness, no stops. You settle deeper into the saddle. You ignore the thirst, you ignore the pressure, and you ride. Because in this army, holding it in isn't just survival. It's discipline. It's the smell you notice first. Sharp, earthy, unmistakable. Burning dung. Specifically, camel dung. Though sometimes horse or yak or goat. It depends on what's nearby, what's dry, and what's been stepped on least recently. Because here in the steppe, if you want a fire, you're not chopping logs. You're gathering the byproducts of your closest companions. This is how the Mongols cooked. Over open fires, fueled by the leavings of the animals they relied on. Efficient. Incredibly. Pleasant? Only if you've completely numbed your nose. The camp you've stopped in tonight smells like stewed mutton with a top note of sun-baked excrement. And you're somehow both starving and mildly horrified. But that fire, the one burning a combination of dried camel chips and optimism, is heating a pot of bortsog, fried dough that's just barely edible and has the texture of stale fortune cookies. It's also warming your one chance at a warm meal before the cold settles in. Yet, it brings problems, because burning dung has a very particular scent that gets into everything. Your clothes, your hair, and yes, your food. That faint, smoky flavor in your stew, that's not hickory, that's camel memories. Historians still argue whether Mongols preferred camel over other fuels. Camel dung burns hotter and longer than horse, but horse was more plentiful. Sheep. Short flame. Goat? Forget it. The best was dry, compact, and not too green. And the best collectors were often the youngest, sent out to comb the nearby ground with baskets, gathering firepower, quite literally, from the ground up. You watch a youth drop a basket beside the fire. He's grinning, possibly proud, possibly delirious. It's not just the fire that makes the situation difficult. It's the timing. You're just starting to relax, maybe feel the warmth again in your fingers when your stomach growls. Not the polite kind. The kind that announces, "Evacuate soon, or there will be consequences." And you realize the problem. The food is hot. The fire is warm. But you're digesting a mix of dried meat, spoiled milk, and emotional trauma. And that particular cocktail reacts very badly with camel dung smoked anything. So begins the internal war. Do you keep eating? Or do you ride out the hunger and avoid another round of digestive roulette? The others? They eat without hesitation. They've lived through worse smells. They've eaten worse things. You suspect some of them have lost their sense of smell entirely, which might actually be a gift out here. You, on the other hand, are sweating. Every bite is a gamble. Every chew a question mark. You reach into your saddlebag and find that same chunk of borts from 2 days ago. It's somehow harder now, like it's petrified into a fossil. You try to bite it anyway. You fail. And then, to make matters worse, someone throws a fresh pat on the fire. The smell rises instantly, thick and full of doom. You look down at your bowl. You look around at the other riders. No one even blinks. This is normal. Your stomach lurches. This is your life now. You take another bite anyway, because there's no other option. And because, perversely, you're hungry, you remember reading a footnote, just a footnote, in a massive book on Mongol logistics. Cooking fuel often dictated both menu and troop morale. That's it, no elaboration. But now you feel what that means. Because every meal cooked over this fire reminds you what made it possible. And the worst news, you're going to smell like it for the rest of the week. You sit back, sigh, and try to accept the inevitable. The steppe provides. Sometimes grass, sometimes meat, sometimes fuel, sometimes all three in the same bite. You've made it through the night. Barely. Your stomach has been performing a slow, uncertain drum solo for the last few hours, interrupted only by the occasional pang of regret and the gentle rustle of a goatskin tent flap. But today, the march resumes, and your insides are not on board with this decision. You mount up, wincing as everything below the waist protests. You've made peace with pain. What you haven't made peace with is the slow, creeping certainty that whatever you ate last night is now plotting revenge. It's a long, steady ride today. One of those seemingly endless stretches of flat land where every horizon looks like a mirage of the last. There's no distraction, no excitement, just dust, sun, and the creeping horror that you might not make it to the next camp intact. And then you remember the stories. The whispers, the suggestions in old scrolls and letters that digestive disasters had actually delayed some Mongol military campaigns. It sounds absurd. These were the most efficient conquerors the world had ever seen. Lightning-fast raids, strategic brilliance, cities razed before their residents finished breakfast. But even unstoppable warriors had one very stoppable weakness: diarrhea. Historians still debate whether any major battles were postponed due to mass illness. Some suggest that outbreaks of indigestion among cavalry units, especially after dietary changes or spoiled provisions, were quietly noted, if not formally recorded. Others point to irregular gaps in campaign timelines and wonder, was it rain or was it kumis? There's an old anecdote, passed through Central Asian oral traditions, of a siege being delayed because the horses wouldn't approach the enemy walls. Not out of fear, but because their riders were too light in the saddle, if you catch the drift. The commander, apparently furious, ordered that the next batch of fermented milk be checked for rot. 3 soldiers reportedly confessed to reusing old milk skins. You try not to think about how old your own kumi skin is. You also try not to think about how long you have before your body insists on an unscheduled break. The truth is, your stomach is waging its own tiny rebellion, and there's no protocol for this, no training exercise. Know what to do if you feel like dying mid-trot section in the Mongol handbook. You shift forward, then backward. You're not seeking comfort anymore. You're simply looking for a position that doesn't make everything worse. The other riders, still stoic, still pretending their organs haven't liquefied. It's incredible. Or maybe it's denial. Either way, they remain upright and unbothered while you quietly begin negotiations with the digestive gods. You think back to an account you once read, an exhausted monk scribbling by firelight about the warriors who ride without ceasing, even as the blood drains from their faces. At the time, you assumed he meant wounds. Now, you're not so sure. You'd always thought the Mongol Empire ran on fear and horses. Now you know better. It ran on sheer, defiant, intestinal willpower, because stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant death. And if a campaign faltered because half the riders were busy fertilizing the wrong side of the river, history wouldn't care why, only that they lost. You grip your reins tighter, you swallow hard, because today you're not just fighting exhaustion. You're fighting an uprising, and this is one battle you really can't afford to lose. By now you've accepted that your body is no longer yours. It belongs to the rhythm of the horse, the will of the horde, and the very basic agreement that nothing interrupts the forward motion of this cavalry train. So when the nausea hits, it's not a surprise. It's more like an inevitability. You feel it creeping up, like a slow wave of doom rising from your gut to your throat. There's no time to warn anyone. Not that anyone would care. Mongol riders are not known for their nurturing bedside manner. You bend slightly, grab the edge of your saddle, and try to breathe through it. It helps. For 4 seconds, then it's happening. You lean to the side, close your eyes, and let go. Vomiting on horseback is not graceful. It's not something anyone teaches you. There's no dignified technique, but somehow you manage. You think you even aimed away from your horse, though judging by the snort and sidestep, your aim might have been optimistic. And no one says a word. One rider glances over. His face remains blank. His eyes say everything. Rookie. It turns out, vomiting while riding wasn't unheard of. In fact, there are a few accounts that make you feel slightly less alone in your humiliation. A Persian ambassador once noted that Mongol riders would sometimes spew from both ends during long marches without ever dismounting. It was recorded without mockery, just fact. As if it were as ordinary as changing direction or tying a sash. Historians still argue whether this happened often or only under extreme conditions, spoiled food, water from suspect sources, or poor fermentation. But even the fact that it's mentioned means it happened enough to matter. And here's the part that really sticks with you. They didn't stop for it. Not for vomiting, not for dizziness, not for sweats, chills, or the awful full-body lurch that makes you think you might actually die from embarrassment alone. You just wiped your mouth, adjusted your tunic, and kept going. You do exactly that. You pull your scarf up to hide the mess. You ignore the stinging in your eyes. You act like nothing happened. This is how you earn your place in the horde, not by strength or speed, but by sheer stubbornness. You start to wonder if there was a secret phrase passed around among veterans. Something like, if you haven't puked in the saddle, you haven't ridden far enough. You kind of wish someone had told you that earlier. Your horse seems unfazed. A little annoyed maybe, but not shocked. This pony has seen things. This pony has smelled things. You whisper an apology anyway. And then you ride on, because what else can you do? There's a strange moment, as your body recovers, where everything quiets down. The nausea passes. Your legs go back to being merely sore instead of screaming. The wind feels cool again. The motion of the horse is almost soothing. You feel like you've leveled up. Because this, apparently, is part of the initiation. It's not about swords or arrows. It's not about victory chants or epic speeches. It's about finding the strength to vomit off a galloping horse, pretend it didn't happen, and keep moving. And that, somehow, is the most Mongol thing you've done all day. You've adjusted to many things by now. The chafing, the gut turmoil, the horse's total disinterest in your personal crises. But nothing quite prepares you for this next revelation. The Mongols may have smelled so overwhelmingly bad that it actually worked in their favor during battle. Yes, weaponized body odor. It's a theory, strange, but surprisingly credible. Several chroniclers noted the odor of Mongol armies long before they even saw the riders themselves. Persian scribes described it as sour and sharp, like burned curd and wet wool. A few envoys used the word suffocating, and one terrified monk wrote, rather uncharitably, that they carried the breath of carrion upon their cloaks. You shift in your saddle and sniff cautiously. Yep, you're getting there. The reasons are obvious. Minimal bathing, heavy layers of unwashed wool and leather, sweat fermented over days of riding, and of course, meat, milk, and smoke soaked into every fiber of clothing. Add a complete lack of breathable fabric and the occasional mishap involving bodily functions, and you've got yourself a mobile fog of terror. And apparently, it worked. There's a passage in the secret histories of the Yuan dynasty that describes a Chinese outpost panicking at the invisible cloud that arrived before the Mongols themselves. No arrows had flown. No drums had sounded. Just the unmistakable scent of riders who hadn't bathed in 3 campaigns. Morale reportedly collapsed before the first sword was drawn. Historians still argue whether this was genuine psychological warfare or simply a byproduct of necessity. Were the Mongols deliberately cultivating this potent aura, or did they just not care, and the results happened to be terrifying? One theory goes even further, that smell became a kind of signature, a warning, like the rumble of hooves, but in olfactory form. You smell it, you flee. Simple as that. You try to picture yourself now, galloping toward an enemy encampment, trailing a wake of fermented milk vapor and leather sweat. Would you be feared or pitied? Probably both. The funny part is, within their own ranks, no one seemed to mind. Or rather, they didn't notice. Smell is relative. When everyone around you has adopted the same olfactory profile, saddle funk, stew smoke, and whatever happened behind that yurt last night, you adjust. You bond through the stench. You stop flinching. You realize, grimly, that you haven't really noticed the smell for the past hour. That's not good. That's adaptation. The practical side of it, though, can't be denied. Mongol gear wasn't easy to clean. Their heavy coats, deal, were made of layers of felt and animal hide, meant to trap warmth and block wind. But they also trapped everything else. You wore them for days, sometimes weeks. When they got wet, they steamed. When they dried, they stiffened. Either way, they absorbed. Soap was a luxury. Water was scarce. Personal fragrance was a fever dream from a far-off land with too many rivers. So you embraced the reek. Or rather, it embraced you, like a thick, damp blanket that never lets go. You glance at the rider beside you. His expression is as unreadable as always, but his scent, immediate. Bold, assertive, you nod with a kind of horrified respect. You too are part of this now, a living, breathing, galloping bouquet of conquest. And as your pony snorts and your coat flaps in the wind, you realize one simple, inescapable truth. You are no longer riding with the smell. You are the smell. You're not usually the superstitious type, but after everything you've smelled, endured, and violently digested in the last 2 days, you're starting to see why the Mongols believed that waste attracted spirits. Not metaphorically, literally. You overhear it around the campfire. Quiet murmurs, old stories. The kind of whispered warnings passed from veteran to recruit when the wind's just right and everyone's staring into the flames, pretending their stomachs aren't staging a riot. Don't relieve yourself near sacred stones. Don't turn your back to the fire when you do it. And for heaven's sake, never look down the hole after dark. because they believed that bodily waste, especially if left in the wrong place or mishandled, could invite trouble. Spirits of illness, misfortune, or ancestral shame. There were stories of men who got sick not from bad food, but from offending the land, from peeing in the wrong place, from disrespecting the invisible world, just trying to nap beneath the soil. It sounds ridiculous, until you realize how wide and silent the steppe really is. There's no bustling town square, no alleyway lights. Just wind, grass, stars, and the occasional distant owl reminding you that you're not as alone as you think. You suddenly understand how something as simple as a cold breeze at the wrong time might feel like a warning. How the stillness around a poorly chosen latrine could make your skin crawl. Historians still debate how deep this superstition ran. Some accounts say that Genghis Khan himself observed purification rituals after long campaigns, burning waste or burying it far from the main camp. Others suggest that the shamans, Bono, warned against careless urination near sacred hills or rivers, believing it could upset the balance between man and nature. You clutch your water skin and stare at the horizon, remembering that yesterday you definitely handled your situation behind a stone that might have looked vaguely sacred, or at least like it had a face. You didn't mean to. It was just there. Now you're convinced something's watching you. Mongol shamans were highly respected in the horde. They interpreted dreams, guided war plans, and kept track of omens, and they were especially picky about spiritual cleanliness. You could ride for a week with dried blood on your hands, but if you stepped too close to a spirit mound while taking care of business, that was a problem. There's even a theory that some of the more outlandish battlefield defeats in Mongol history were blamed not on strategy, but on someone accidentally defiling a sacred spring. It wasn't the arrows, they'd say. It was Terma's bad bladder. You glance around nervously, wondering if anyone else is feeling the same creeping paranoia. One rider spits casually into the dust. Another offers a brief bow toward a rock shaped like a hunched old man. You make a mental note to do that too, just in case. You think of a line you read once, scrawled in the margins of a traveler's journal. Here, even excrement has a spirit. At the time, you laughed. Now, you're not so sure, because when the sky turns purple, and the only sound is the clink of tack and the occasional stomach gurgle, it becomes very easy to believe that someone, or something, is watching from just beyond the next hill. Not an enemy, not a wolf, just a spirit. Mildly annoyed, and probably smelling you from miles away. You've been holding in questions for days about comfort, pain, shame, and mysterious fires. But this one feels different. It gnaws at you as stubbornly as the saddle gnaws at your thighs. Why doesn't anyone talk about this? Not in the stories, not in the epics, not in the grand tales of conquest and diplomacy and thundering hooves. Mongol history is full of numbers. How far they could ride in a day, how many arrows they carried, how many cities they burned. But nowhere do the scrolls mention the fact that sometimes warriors had to pause in the middle of a prairie to let loose yesterday's curd and goat fat stew. Why? You ride in silence and you realize the answer is exactly that. Silence. Because Mongols didn't talk about it. Not officially. Not publicly, not in poetry or song. It was beneath mention, both figuratively and, well, literally. And yet it happened. Every single rider had to deal with it. Every single scout. Every legendary general. Even Genghis himself, with his fierce presence and terrifying commands, had moments when nature didn't care who he was. Historians still argue whether this omission was intentional or just cultural. Some suggest it was part of a broader pattern in Mongol storytelling, glorifying strength, speed, victory, and never weakness. Others say the answer lies in the nature of oral tradition itself. People don't repeat what doesn't impress, even if it's universal. You conquer nations. You don't compose odes to indigestion. But the truth, the unspoken underlayer of it all, is still there, written between the lines, wrapped in the folds of woolen trousers, soaked into the edges of the saddle. And now you understand the quiet nods, the thousand-yard stares, the brief, wordless moments when a rider dismounts and no one asks where he went, the avoidance of detail, even among those who know exactly what he's dealing with. You think about your own experience. How much you've endured, how many humiliations you've swallowed, and how few of them you'd ever willingly admit. Because saying it out loud feels like breaking a rule. Even now, in the silence of a moving horde, you feel the weight of that code. It's not shame, it's stoicism. The idea that a warrior doesn't dwell on the discomfort. He rides through it. He internalizes it. He digests it, emotionally at least. It's why no one asked about your unfortunate detour yesterday. Why no one laughed when you vomited, even though they definitely noticed. You've been accepted now, not by title or deed, but by experience. You earned it, one horrible, dusty bowel movement at a time. There's a bond here, not spoken, not acknowledged, but deeply, profoundly shared. You glance at the young rider beside you. He looks green, pale. He shifts constantly in his saddle. He's sweating in that particular way that only someone trying very hard not to lose control can sweat. You don't say anything. You don't need to, because that's the Mongol way. No one talks about it, but everyone knows. They arrived at the edge of the empire with silk robes, incense, and very delicate shoes. Persian scribes, Chinese envoys, Russian emissaries, all of them brave in their own way, and none of them remotely ready for what the Mongol steppe had in store. These were the letter writers, the diplomats, the men with scrolls and honorifics who had been sent to speak with the great Khan, or more accurately, to survive the meeting and make it back alive. Many did, but none came back the same, and the letters they wrote. They're some of the most unintentionally hilarious and revealing documents in medieval history. You've read them. Thinly veiled horror, wrapped in calligraphy. Elegant handwriting describing, in painfully polite terms, what it's like to eat fermented horse milk, watch someone skin a sheep in the middle of a council meeting, and, most memorably, cope with the utter absence of latrines. You picture it. A Persian courtier trying not to gag as he's offered kumis that's still warm. A Chinese monk frantically looking for a privacy screen on a plane with no rocks taller than a goat. A Russian envoy politely asking if there's a bathhouse nearby and receiving only confused stares in return. One Persian observer, traveling with a diplomatic mission in the 1240s, wrote, "Their camps are orderly, their horses tireless, and their customs most alien. They do not dig privies, but walk into the wind and lower their garments, with no sense of shame." I turned my face away. A Chinese scribe, less tactful, recorded, "I was given a bowl of broth, while the man opposite me cleaned his teeth with the end of a knife. Moments later, he disappeared behind a cart. I did not inquire." Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerated out of revulsion or simple culture shock. But the pattern is clear. Those not born to the steppe found its rhythms difficult to digest, literally and otherwise. You wonder how many of these men packed essentials, scrolls, seals, ceremonial hats, and forgot to bring something as simple as a cloth to clean themselves with. One poor envoy, recorded anonymously in a Russian monastery archive, supposedly refused to eat for 2 days after watching a warrior squeeze something unpleasant from his own saddle pad. The monk who wrote the record added, "He claimed to have seen demons. We suspect it was digestion." You can't blame them. The Mongol lifestyle, stripped of ceremony, had a way of disarming even the most composed bureaucrats. In a culture where removing your boots was the height of vulnerability, talking about digestion was, in itself, a faux pas. And yet, some of the most oddly poetic lines in those ancient letters are clearly written in the aftermath of digestive defeat. I sat upon a beast I could not name, upon a saddle that bruised me, beside a man who sang to his goat. And yet I feared to ask where I might relieve myself. In this silence, I grew older. You think about that man, alone, clenched, trying to maintain dignity in a world that didn't care about dignity, only endurance. And now, centuries later, you understand him completely. Because once you've had to walk half a mile into the wind, holding your belt in one hand and your shame in the other, you realize that there's no higher diplomatic skill than pretending everything's fine, especially when it absolutely isn't. The wind today is cruel, sharp, slicing across the steppe like a cold blade. Your nose is numb, your fingers ache, and your ears feel like they might snap off if you so much as tilt your head. But worst of all, you feel it. That deep, low stirring in your gut. The one that says, now, or else. It couldn't come at a worse time. Because squatting in the cold isn't just miserable, it's dangerous. You slow your horse, eyes scanning for cover that doesn't exist. There are no trees, no rocks. Just a frozen horizon and the occasional miserable goat. You could ride for miles and still not find privacy or shelter. And even if you did, your trousers, those stubborn, scratchy wool trousers, are not built for speed or dexterity. They're built to humiliate you in moments like this. You finally dismount, the cold hitting your legs like a slap. Your hands fumble at your belt. The wind cuts through every layer, and then the worst happens. The cold tightens your muscles, locks everything down. Your body refuses to cooperate. Historians still argue about how Mongols dealt with winter sanitation. The records are vague, possibly because even the scribes didn't want to think about it. But one thing is certain. Cold weather complicated everything. What took moments in summer became a logistical nightmare in January. Some researchers suggest Mongols learned to time their relief to coincide with fire stops, warming their hands before attempting to undress, even placing their gloves over steam vents inside the yurt before braving the cold. Others speculate they simply learned to do it faster. No lingering, no thinking. Just crouch, clench, and pray. You crouch now, knees shaking. The wind pushes against your back, carrying snowflakes that sting your skin like insects. Your breath fogs in front of you. Time slows. Your horse turns its head to look. There is no sympathy in that stare, only disappointment. You finish quickly, too quickly, and now comes the final test. Cleanup. There's no soft moss, no cloth, no snowball big enough to make this better. Just you, the edge of your tunic, and a burning desire never to speak of this again. Back at the yurt, others are warming their hands around a fresh fire, steam rising from their boots. One older rider eyes you as you stumble back into the circle. He doesn't say a word, but he knows. They all know. It's a rite of passage. Every Mongol, from scout to shaman, has faced the winter squat. Some emerged wiser. Others just emerged with frostbite. You wrap your cloak tighter, trying to warm up, trying to forget. And then someone passes you a bowl of stew. You hesitate, because you know exactly what happens next, but you take it anyway. Because this is the cycle. Eat. Endure. Evacuate. Repeat. It's not glamorous. It's not heroic. But it's the reality behind every fast-moving, cold-faced warrior on the steppe. And if you can survive relieving yourself in a blizzard, you can survive anything. You've heard rumors. Whispers traded between jittery recruits and grizzled veterans when the fires die down and someone finally asks, "What happens if you really can't hold it?" And the answer, shared with a shudder and a half-laugh, is always the same. The helmet. At first, you think it's a joke. It has to be. The Mongol battle helmet, rounded, iron, often lined with fur, was a prized possession, worn with pride and passed down through generations. The idea that someone would use it in that way is absurd. But then you remember how few options exist. When you're miles from camp, the wind is howling, the ground is frozen, and you're surrounded by enemies or comrades, often equally judgmental, you make desperate choices. And sometimes that choice is the helmet. You stare at your own. It hangs from your saddle, cold and silent. You try not to look at it the same way again. There are no confirmed written records of this act. No carved stone says, "Here lies Batar, who once soiled his own helm." But it's the kind of story that persists for generations. Never documented, never denied, always retold. Historians still argue over whether this was ever truly done. Some say it's a myth, a product of outsider exaggeration or military camp humor. Others point to practicality. The Mongol helmet was deep, bowl-like, and often came with a leather liner that could, regretfully, be removed. In the heat of desperation, it might have happened. And what's more Mongol than practicality over propriety? The story that sticks with you is one shared by a Kazakh oral historian. A tale of a scout separated from his unit, trapped in a snowstorm, unable to stop without freezing. His only options were his coat or his helmet. He chose the helmet. He survived. His comrades never let him forget it. You imagine the moment. A young warrior, shivering, panicked, eyes darting over the frozen steppe. No bushes. No privacy. Nowhere to go. And so, he removes his helmet, places it on the ground, and turns his back to fate. You wonder what he did afterward. Was there a rinsing protocol? Did he explain it when he returned to camp? Or did he simply wipe it out, strap it back on, and say nothing? Probably that. Because Mongols didn't complain. They didn't explain. They endured. You glance at the others riding nearby. One man's helmet is dented. Another's is polished to a near mirror shine. And yet, a dark thought creeps into your head. Has someone used that one? You shake it off, but not entirely. The real horror is this. You're not sure you wouldn't do the same. Because out here, surrounded by silence and dust and 30 pairs of equally clenched thighs, your dignity becomes negotiable. You start asking strange questions like, is this waterproof? And how fast could I rinse this in a stream without being seen? You laugh quietly, then stop. Because now the helmet's hanging there, waiting. You adjust your saddle, refocus on the horizon, and remind yourself that you still have standards. But also a helmet, just in case. You're deep into it now. Not just the journey, not just the discomfort, but the logic of it all. You no longer recoil at the saddle sores, the layers of fermented dairy sweat, or the casual way someone next to you might adjust their trousers mid-gallop. You've reached a place beyond shame. And that's when you learn about the pit trap problem. It sounds like a battlefield tactic, something clever involving trenches and bait. But no, this one's far more personal. Because every once in a while, someone, usually new, usually well-meaning, tries to dig a proper latrine near camp. A nice deep pit. A quiet corner. A hopeful nod to civilization, and then it collapses. Or someone stumbles into it. Or, in one recorded case from the campaign in Kievan Rus, an enemy scout fell into one and was immediately captured. The camp called him "Stinks in Hole" until the end of his very short life. You laugh. Then realize you're standing dangerously close to a suspiciously soft patch of earth. You shuffle away. Pit traps, unintentional or not, became a running joke among some Mongol units. A latrine pit dug in the wrong spot could cave in, flood, or attract scavengers. And in a tightly packed camp, with horses, carts, and yurts forming a busy maze, that was more than embarrassing. It was dangerous. So many camps simply didn't bother. Waste was left on the ground, covered with ash or dirt, sometimes burned, sometimes stomped flat with casual efficiency. There was a logic to it, one rooted in mobility. Why dig a hole when you'll be gone tomorrow? Historians still argue whether organized sanitation ever took root in Mongol logistics. Some say that larger campaign bases had designated filth zones on the downwind edge of camp. Others insist it was more fluid, decisions made by senior riders based on terrain, enemy proximity, and wind direction. Always the wind. You now know to sleep upwind, always upwind. There's one particularly memorable account from a 14th century Persian merchant who visited a temporary Mongol court in Central Asia. He wrote, "I was led past the noble yurts where golden banners flew, and further still, past the horse pens, and still further, until the air grew so foul I thought the end of the world had arrived. There, near a pit ringed with bones and crows, the servants relieved themselves while humming." You wonder if the humming helped. Maybe it was a defense mechanism. Maybe if you sang loudly enough, you could pretend the ground wasn't a landmine of yesterday's regrets. In one chilling variation of the pit trap tale, a high-ranking commander once fell into a hastily dug trench after a midnight drink binge. He survived. But the smell lingered. The next day, he reportedly changed his horse, his clothing, and his name. You don't know if that story's true. But you do know you're not digging anything. You look around camp now with new eyes. Every innocent-looking depression, every pile of dirt, every lightly trampled patch of grass is suspect. The ground is not your friend. It is history's restroom. You find a bare, rocky patch to stand on. You eat standing up now. It feels safer. Someone nearby calls out a joke, something about the pit of despair. A few riders chuckle. It's gallows humor. But the gallows are filled with dung. You nod along. Because out here every step is a test. Every squat is a calculated risk. And the worst defeat is slipping where someone else already lost. By now, you've endured the food, the cramps again, the wind, the winter squat, and the intimate horror of the helmet option. You've seen how a powerful empire runs not just on blood and bows, but on deeply questionable bodily compromises. But here's the kicker. There's a persistent myth floated around in textbooks and travel documentaries that the Mongols were exceptionally clean, not just by steppe standards, by any standards. Some claim they bathed more regularly than Europeans, that they combed their hair fastidiously, that they carried tiny silver tweezers for grooming, and in a way, that's not wrong. But it's also not quite right. It's a myth, born from fragments, select observations, moments frozen in time when Mongol nobles entertained foreign guests and made a point of washing their hands before a feast. That happened. It impressed people. But it wasn't the full picture. The average rider. He was not exfoliating daily. He was trying to avoid frostbite while crouched in a pit, dug with a hoof. The cleanliness stories come mostly from the upper echelons of Mongol society, khans, princes, their entourages, who had access to hot water, fragrant herbs, and thyme. Common soldiers lived a different truth, one where hygiene was practical, not pampering. Historians still argue about how widespread cleanliness practices really were. Some Arabic chroniclers describe Genghis Khan's insistence on hand-washing after meals. Others mention soldiers passing around bone combs during camp downtime. But many also mention the stink, the flies, the hardened stains of travel. So who's right? They all are. Because the Mongols were experts in pragmatic cleanliness. Wash your hands, yes. Keep your saddle clean, definitely, but full-body baths. Only if you're near a hot spring, it's not a holy day, and you're not currently invading anyone. You begin to understand that their version of clean was about function. A clean bowstring. A clean knife. A clean patch of skin where your armor rubbed. Everything else. Optional. You look at your own clothes now, stiff, crusted with sweat, dust, and the unnameable residue of half a dozen fermented meals. It doesn't feel like filth anymore. It feels like armor. Proof that you're still here, still riding, still part of this insane machine. And honestly, you've come to respect it. There's clarity in grime, a kind of brutal equality. No one smells good. No one pretends to. You're all just humans, surviving atop animals, praying for dry grass and favorable winds, and a place to squat that doesn't double as someone else's tragic memory. You'll never look at the word clean the same way again, because out here, on the steppe, clean doesn't mean spotless. It means you're still riding. You've made it far. Farther than you thought possible when this absurd journey began. You've sweated, clenched, shivered, and very nearly wept in the saddle. But nothing prepares you for what today holds, because today they ask you to lead the line, not the vanguard of a glorious battle. Not a diplomatic envoy, just a routine patrol. You and 5 other riders, tasked with scouting the route ahead and holding formation. Which means no stops. None. You nod, stoic. But inside, you are pure terror. There is a certain pressure that comes with riding at the front. Everyone behind you is watching. If you slow down, they slow down. If you veer left, they veer left. And if you happen to, say, stop abruptly, clutch your midsection, and attempt to unlace your trousers with shaking fingers, the entire horde notices. So, you won't be doing that. You'll ride in silence. The wind, as always, is too honest. Your insides are negotiating with themselves like medieval diplomats. Maybe later, says your stomach. Maybe never, whispers your small intestine. You just nod and pray. 1 hour in, you start sweating. 2 hours in, you reach the stage of discomfort, where time ceases to exist. By the 3rd hour, you're convinced that every bounce of your pony's hooves is connected to your soul, and yet you continue. You. Because now you have to. You're in the lead. You're the example. And in the eyes of the Mongols, leadership means discipline, not just of men, but of self. Historians still discuss how the Mongol chain of command worked. It was famously efficient, decentralized, yet responsive, with commanders of 10, then 100, then 1,000. But within that hierarchy, one value dominated all others: self-control. If you couldn't control yourself, you couldn't control anyone else. There's an old quote attributed to Subutai, Genghis Khan's brilliant general. The man who stops to squat is not fit to command. Whether or not he truly said it, the idea spread like wildfire and hardened into doctrine. So here you are, leading, enduring. Internally falling apart, you steal a glance behind you. The others are riding strong, stone-faced. No complaints. One gives you a nod. You're not sure if it's respect or a warning. Maybe both. You whisper encouragement to your horse. You start counting your breaths. You recall every old folk tale you ever heard about turning pain into strength. You try to imagine you're a cloud, a pebble, a well-sealed wineskin. And somehow, impossibly, you make it. 4 hours later, you return to camp with a look of cold resolve and twitching eyelids. You dismount like a hero, knees wobbly, jaw clenched. No one says a word, but you see it in their faces. They know you earned your place today, not by strength or cleverness, but by sheer, horrifying bodily restraint. Someone hands you a bowl of stew. You stare at it, and for the first time in days, you politely decline. Because some victories should not be tested twice in one afternoon. You lie on your back outside the yurt that night, wrapped in a crusty wool cloak, staring up at a sky so full of stars, it looks like someone spilled powdered sugar across a black tabletop. Your bones ache. Your knees throb. Your digestive tract is whispering ominous things about betrayal. And still, you're strangely at peace. You've crossed a threshold, not just of discomfort, but of identity. You're no longer a visitor on this journey. You're part of it. A small, smelly cog in the great galloping machinery of the Mongol world. You hear snoring nearby. A rider who snored last night, while curled up with his saddle as a pillow. Another grunts in his sleep and rolls over, probably dreaming of kumis and less hostile trousers. And you realize they've all done it. Every one of them. The winter squat, the mid-ride lean, the helmet gamble, the rock wipe, the long, painful stare across a windswept plain with clenched fists and a 1,000-yard gaze. But no one talks about it, because out here, silence is its own kind of badge. That's the part the history books always skip. They write about conquest and strategy, siege towers and composite bows, political alliances sealed with goats and daughters. But the secret cost of those empires, the private misery, the endless discomfort, the gritty, unglamorous human part. That's what you've lived now. And somehow, it makes the whole story more real. Historians still argue whether the Mongols won through military genius or sheer physical endurance. The answer, as your legs remind you, is probably both. They were brilliant, yes, but they were also hard. Not just hard-hitting, hard-living. Able to function on sour milk, dried meat, and the unwavering belief that no bodily urge should slow them down. You hear a rustle behind the yurt and spot a silhouette sneaking off into the dark. You smile. A rookie maybe, or just someone who finally couldn't take it anymore. You consider calling out a nickname, but you don't. You just roll over, tug your cloak tighter, and let the steppe cradle you in its cold, dusty arms. Because tonight, for once, you won't need to go anywhere, and that feels like the rarest victory of all. You wake up before the sun, because your horse woke up, because the rider next to you kicked your foot, because your back gave up on sleeping around 4:30. Either way, you're vertical now. Barely. Today is the final stretch. One more ride, one more day of endurance, one more opportunity for your organs to rebel at high speed. You mount with the fluid grace of someone who has become 80% saddle-shaped. The pony snorts, sensing your resignation. The others file in. No one talks. Everyone is saving their energy, or their dignity. You begin to ride. The morning is peaceful. Golden light creeps across the grasslands. The hooves of your unit beat a slow, steady rhythm. You watch a falcon wheel above in a wide arc, indifferent to your bowel history. And somewhere between mile 6 and mile 7, you realize you've stopped thinking about the discomfort. Your legs still ache. Your joints still creak. But it's background noise now. You've accepted it, absorbed it. You are not a passenger anymore. You are part of the horse, the horde, the horizon. It's almost poetic. Until someone in front of you shouts, "Stop!" and veers hard to the left. They dismount quickly, trip slightly, and vanish behind a dip in the terrain. The entire line pauses, waiting. No one says a word. A few riders shift in their saddles, as if debating whether to take the opportunity. You glance around, eyes meet, heads nod. Then 3 more riders dismount and move, very purposefully, in different directions. It's the cavalry version of a bathroom break. You stay mounted. Not because you don't need it, but because you're curious. You've reached that point. The place beyond pain, beyond awkwardness, beyond shame. You want to see what happens next. The first rider returns. No one comments. No jokes, no mocking. Just a space left open for him to slide back into the formation. It strikes you. This too is part of the code. Not silence to suppress, but silence to protect. You've all been there. You all will be again. And in the Mongol horde, every rider eventually meets their moment in the grass. Somewhere, an academic is probably giving a lecture about Mongol cavalry tactics, flanking maneuvers, supply logistics, multi-horse relays. But this is the real stuff. The camaraderie and discomfort. The unspeakable knowledge shared by riders who've spent more time clenching than conquering. The understanding that history isn't just made by generals and maps, but by tired people on tired horses making the best of very bad options. You adjust your scarf. The wind picks up. You ride on. And though your body still protests, your spirit is somehow lighter. The ride is done. The sun begins its slow descent over the western horizon, bathing the steppe in a warm amber glow. Shadows stretch long across the grass, and the wind that once slapped your cheeks now brushes your face like a tired sigh. Your horse slows to a gentle walk. You don't need to steer anymore. He knows the way back to camp, and frankly, you're too worn out to argue. Everything feels softer now. The motion of the ride, once a relentless thumping against your bones, is just a rhythm. Steady, grounding. Your body, though battered, has found its peace with the motion. The cramps have passed, the discomfort dulled. What's left is a quiet ache, and a deep, almost absurd sense of pride. You've done it. You've ridden with the horde. Not in a storybook battle, not in some glorious charge, but in the most intimate, ridiculous, human way possible. Through the petty, unspoken miseries that really define what it means to live as a Mongol rider. You breathe deeply, the cool air filling your lungs. It smells of dust, of horses, of firewood, and a hint of what might still be lingering from breakfast. But you don't mind. It smells like survival. The camp comes into view. Smoke rising in lazy spirals from yurts. Distant laughter, the flap of canvas against poles. A place where you'll eat, rest, maybe even wash your hands in a shared bowl of warm water. Not fancy, not private. But enough. You dismount slowly, carefully, like you've aged a decade in a week. Your knees tremble, then lock into place. You pat your pony. He ignores you. Of course he does. You walk toward your tent, the last light painting gold across your boots. You don't speak. No one needs you to. You've endured, and now you can rest. Sweet dreams.